Okay, so here we are starting to talk about more photosynthesis, part 2. So remember, in part 1 we were taking a look at the basics behind photosynthesis and what it needs. Think about the light we talked about, the light issue associated with photosynthesis. And then we talked about the old cyclic system, that circular system where we followed the electrons. They bounced up, they went down the electron transport system and produced ATP, and then the electrons got cycled back into the system in just the circular path. Again, it was good when it was the only way to make energy through photosynthesis, but it wasn't optimal. There were challenges with that pathway. And evolution is all about improving upon an existing plan. Don't reinvent the wheel, simply modify slightly to make it better. Consider your phone. Is it the iPhone 5, 6, 7, 8? I guarantee there's going to be a 9, a 10, 11. They're just going to keep making little tweaks to improve upon the existing plan to try to make it a little better. Oh, let's give you a bigger memory. Let's give you faster speed. Let's give you more storage, etc. Better stabilization on your camera. Everything else is pretty much the original. They're just tweaking and modifying. That's how the new non-cyclic system of photosynthesis evolves. Okay, it is the original old cyclic system that's been tweaked and upgraded. So the new system is non-cyclic. So this means it does not go in a circle. Non-cyclic is a straight line, like that. All right? So the electrons are going in this straight line. And the key with photosynthesis, follow the electrons. All right? So it involves two steps. Step 1 is called the light-dependent reaction. All right, now this is going to take place in the pigment. Specifically, those little things called the grana. That's where light-dependent reaction is going to occur. This over here. All right, so in order to do this part of photosynthesis, it's going to require sunlight or a light source. Ideally sunlight, that's the optimal, but some plants can do it in fluorescent lights. Think about growing a plant in your house. It's going to require water, and then this step also requires the pigments. It could be chlorophyll A, it could be chlorophyll B, it could be the carotenes, the reds, the oranges, the yellows, etc. And then it's going to produce, during step 1, it's going to produce oxygen, ATP, and this thing called NADPH. Now, you're going to see me refer back to these. NADPH is literally a wheelbarrow that carries electrons, and I can't fit it in there, but they'll also carry hydrogen ions. That should be inside the wheelbarrow. Okay, so that's going to be an important structure to remember is this NADPH, little carrier molecule. So, okay, so let's take a look at how this works. Sunlight. There's our sun. That energy hits the green pigments. Pigments get excited. And what do? We follow the electrons. Electrons shoot up. They get caught, and then they get moved over to the electron transport system. Here's your series of steps. Electron transport system, electron transport chain, and those electrons go ta-ding, 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 and wind up in the other photosystem, the other group of pigment molecules. So these are electrons just bouncing down the steps. Now as they bounce, they drive ATP formation. So that makes this part of the reaction happy. We made ATP. Yay! But let's keep watching the electrons. Right now they're down here. They're excited again. they get caught in a second acceptor because they got excited by sunlight, and then those electrons got placed into the wheelbarrow called NADPH. Okay, so the electron winds up in there. There's our electron. All right. Now, we need to get more electrons, because if we started with 100 and all 100 wind up in that wheelbarrow, you got to replace them. This is where water comes in. This is why water is a requirement for this part of the pathway. So water right here gets ripped apart. Break those bonds. It's a thing called hydrolysis or photolysis, breaking of the water bonds. And when you break the water bonds, the electrons get released, and those go up into this group of pigment molecules. So there's your constant supply of electrons. By busting out the water, break the water up, and put it into this group of pigment molecules. Now when you break apart water, you're left with hydrogens, 2 of them, and you're left with oxygens. Okay, so consider what would happen to the pH of this environment if these hydrogens continue to accumulate. pH is a measure of hydrogen concentration. So if you build up a bunch of hydrogen ions, the pH of the solution or the system is going to decrease. And as pH changes, enzymes denature. This would collapse the system. So those hydrogens have to get moved out. This is where the wheelbarrow comes into the picture. So follow the hydrogen. Here we go. And bonk. Hydrogens go in. And now we form NADPH because of the hydrogens. All right, but we're also left with a couple oxygens floating around. Or actually, be lots of oxygens. Well, those oxygens double bond together to each other, and they form the gas O2. That gas can actually physically be seen diffusing out of the cells of plants. So you look at an aquatic plant, and you'll see these little bubbles forming. Those bubbles are oxygen bubbles that are being created because of the rupture of the water here, or the photolysis of the water. Okay, so those are the products of this part of photosynthesis of the non-cyclic system. You got oxygen produced, diffuses out of the cell, ATP is produced, cell uses it for energy, and then NADPH is produced as a carrier molecule to take the hydrogens and the electrons to step 2. So this little wheelbarrow goes to step 2. Now, as long as we have a continuous supply of water, we can keep replacing the electrons, keep making oxygen, hydrogens go into the little wheelbarrow, and that all moves to step 2. All right, now step 2. It's kind of like the paddle wheel. It's a circle. It's a cycle. Step 2 is known as the light independent reaction. It does not require light for this part of the reaction to work. Instead, what it requires is carbon dioxide, ATP, and NADPH. Okay, so the good news is in step 1, the plant made ATP, and the plant also made all those little wheelbarrows, the NADPHs. And these are the same wheelbarrow. It's just moving over into step 2. So there's our little wheelbarrow, supposed to be, NADPH. So it's got hydrogens and electrons. All right, so step 2 is going to occur. Let me get back up here. This occurs within the stroma of the cell. So that space within the chloroplast between the stacks of green coins, that's where step 2 is going to be happening, within the stroma. Nope, that didn't do it. It's trying to get it up there so it'd be easier to see. Alright, occurs within the stroma. There we go. Alright, so step 2, light independent. Sunlight's not required. Carbon dioxide, ATP, NADPH. Okay, so CO2 goes in, and it starts spinning and turning and changing. In order to spin, ATP is being used. ATP turns this wheel. Here comes the wheelbarrow, NADPH, and NADPH will dump hydrogens and electrons into this, we call it the wheel, or Calvin cycle, or you'll see it called Calvin-Benson cycle. So what we're looking at is carbons, oxygens, and hydrogens all combined with electrons. ATP spins and enables these things to change from one shape to another, and basically mixing and matching and reattaching, and ultimately it's going to produce glucose. What's going to produce is C6H12O6. That is the chemical formula for glucose. 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. Okay, so the ultimate end products of photosynthesis are oxygen and C6H12O6. So oxygen, let me redo it, write it in a different way. Oxygen and glucose. Those are the end products. Now the oxygen will diffuse out of the cell, out of the plant, goes into the atmosphere. We're breathing it right now and using it on a daily basis. The glucose depends on what part of the life cycle the plant's in. The glucose may get combined together to form cellulose, so now it can grow and make more branches and leaves and roots. It may combine it into starch and store it as a form of long-term energy. Maybe it's the type of plant that stores it as sucrose. Maybe it puts it into an apple or into the fruit of a banana or wherever the plant may store it. But those are the end products of photosynthesis that we want to keep in mind. So all the producers, not all, the vast majority of producers on Earth are running the 2-stage photosynthesis pathway. They're making oxygen and glucose and again using it for whatever is appropriate at that point of the life cycle. But what we see is as plants have evolved to different environments, they've taken photosynthesis, they work with that pathway, but they kind of tweak it and modify it and use it to enable them to survive as best as possible in different environmental conditions. So one example is a group of plants called the C3 plants. Now these are plants that like it cool and moist. Right? These plants are your spring plants. This is what comes up early spring and will also be flowering in the fall. So you think about our lawns, grass, Easter lilies, things like that. Those plants that come up and flower in the spring or later in the fall, those little mums that we see around September and October, those are all C3 plants. Okay, so they do really well in cool environments. They run photosynthesis very effectively when it's cool, it's moist. They have great reproductive potential that time of the year. But then as it gets warmer, these plants don't do so well. Okay, so there's a little saying, a little rhyme about April showers bringing May flowers. Well, those April showers are feeding and helping C3 plants grow really well and flower in May. All right, in the next lecture, we're going to talk about C4 plants and the CAM plants and how they use this pathway.